Das schaffen wir jetzt nicht wieder in Deutschland.
Sie wollten, Herr, kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
There are figures in the pages of history whose names, when mentioned, evoke not only a particular era, but also the darkest face of humanity. One of them is undoubtedly Adolf Hitler. Amidst the ruins of World War I, languishing as a homeless painter in Vienna, no one could have predicted that he would become one of history's greatest monsters. No one could have predicted that his words would sweep millions in his wake, set a continent ablaze, and disrupt billions of lives. So how did this astonishing journey from an ordinary dreamer to an absolute dictator begin? This video starkly reveals the dark and disturbing truth of Adolf Hitler's rise to power. This is not only the story of a leader, but also a sobering lesson in how a society falls victim to despair and manipulation. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in a town near the German border of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His childhood was marked by a troubled relationship with his authoritarian and strict father figure, Alois Hitler. Despite his father's expectations of a civil service position, young Adolf was drawn to art, especially painting. However, his talent for painting was not sufficient to gain admission to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. He was rejected twice. These rejections led to a deep sense of resentment, a sense of failure, and anger towards the world. The years he spent in Vienna, 1907 to 1913, were filled with poverty, a sense of anonymity and exclusion. Living in a homeless shelter and trying to survive by drawing pictures on postcards, Hitler lived in Austria's cosmopolitan life during this period. He became acquainted with the structure of the German Empire, particularly influenced by the anti-Semitic populism of Vienna mayor Karl Lueger at the time. The seeds of his hatred for Jews, Slavs, and Marxists were sown during these years and began to develop into a systematic ideology. The fiercely anti-Semitic and German nationalist atmosphere of the time in Vienna further strengthened his already existing prejudices. His perverse beliefs in the superiority of the Germanic race and his great German nationalism began to take shape during this period. Adolf, who moved from Vienna to Munich, Germany, in 1913, joined the German army as a volunteer despite his Austrian citizenship at the outbreak of World War I. It was clear that the horrors of war, life in the trenches as a corporal on the Western Front, the devastation he witnessed on the front lines, and the suffering of the German people left a deep mark on his mind. Germany's defeat and the harsh conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles that followed were a national disaster and a loss of honor in Hitler's eyes. He held these internal enemies, especially the Jews, responsible for this defeat, and those he labeled butchers. His hatred for Marxists had now become not just a personal rage, but a quest for national vengeance. A mere dreamer, he had now embarked on the path of becoming a political hater. The economic and psychological devastation of post-war Germany was the most fertile soil for these seeds to flourish. The people were desperate for a solution and were ready to open their ears to even the most radical promises. It was in this atmosphere that Adolf Hitler began his journey to power, a journey he would build upon this very despair and anger. When he returned to Munich in 1919, he landed in a city where the political climate was boiling. He was assigned by the army to monitor the activities of a small, nationalist, and anti-Semitic political group called the German Workers' Party, DAP. In these meetings, Hitler's greatest talent, his oratorical power, which could hypnotize the masses, enrage them, and simultaneously inspire hope, was revealed. In his speeches, he condemned the Treaty of Versailles as a betrayal, blaming the Jews for hyperinflation, unemployment, and national humiliation. He portrayed communists and internal enemies. This impressive oratory prowess led him to join the party he was tasked with monitoring, and he quickly became one of its most active speakers. Hitler rose rapidly within the party, changing its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, Nazi Party, in 1920, and adopting the swastika symbol. This symbol was not merely an emblem, but also a reflection of the party's ambitious and ruthless ideology. Hitler's leadership qualities and influence over the party steadily increased. In 1921, following a leadership crisis within the party, Hitler announced his resignation. Prominent party figures recognized the indispensability of Hitler's influence over the masses and his oratory skills. They pleaded for his return. Using this situation to his advantage, Hitler demanded the title of Führer, leader of the party, a request that was granted. Thus, he quickly rose from a junior party member to a leader vested with absolute authority. This was the first major test of his political genius and manipulation skills. He became the sole authority over the party. The 1923 Beer Hall Putsch was Hitler's greatest early failure. His attempt to seize power in Munich was brutally suppressed by state forces, and Hitler was imprisoned. However, this failure taught him a crucial lesson. The path to power should be through legal means, exploiting the democratic system itself, not an illegal coup. His book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, written while in prison, would form the ideological basis for his anti-Semitism, Lebensraum, living space, German racial superiority, and future expansionist policies. This book was not only a manifesto, but also a dark mirror of Hitler's mind and a guide to his future actions. It was during this period that he developed his propaganda strategies and mass manipulation techniques in detail, learning how to appeal to the people's deepest fears and desires. Although Germany achieved relative economic stability under Gustav Stresemann in the late 1920s, the Great Depression of 1929 disrupted everything. The collapse of the global economy plunged Germany once again into a deep crisis. Millions were unemployed, banks collapsed, and political polarization escalated again. This situation played into Hitler and the Nazis' hands. Amidst the social collapse, they emerged promising to restore order and prosperity and make Germany great again. However, these promises were part of a carefully woven propaganda network. Their aim was not so much to promise anything, but to impose an ideology based on hatred and fear on the masses. Hitler and his loyal propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, established the most effective and dangerous propaganda machine in history. In their hands, propaganda became not just a political tool, but a flawless art form, manipulating mass psychology. Massive rallies, stadiums adorned with massive banners, orchestras, and marches were transformed into religious ceremonies. These demonstrations were tools that dissolved individuals into the crowd, generated emotional fervor, and suppressed critical thought. Hitler's powerful, charismatic, and hateful speeches were broadcast to every home via radio. Cinemas screened films filled with Nazi propaganda. Films like Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will exalted Hitler as a virtually godlike figure. Symbols, the swastika, slogans, Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer, one people, one empire, one leader, and the mass media were used flawlessly to capture the public's mind. Jews, communists, homosexuals, and other undesirable groups were targeted, and all their anger and frustration was directed at them. This was one of the most brutal examples of the scapegoating mechanism. Dissenting voices were silenced, newspapers were censored, and fear and repression became a part of daily life. The Nazi Party had become not just a political movement, but an ideological apparatus that permeated every aspect of society, from school curricula to youth movements, from family life to art and science. Everything was filtered through Nazi ideology. During this period, some Germans consciously submitted to these manipulations, while others chose to remain silent in fear and despair. Hitler was determined to come to power through legal means, and he implemented this strategy step by step. He participated in elections and brought his party members into the Reichstag, German parliament. Following the political chaos of the Weimar Republic and the formation of a succession of unstable coalition governments, he was appointed Chancellor, Prime Minister, by President Paul von Hindenburg on January 30th, 1933. However, this was only the beginning. Hitler's ultimate goal was to seize absolute power. Shortly after becoming Chancellor on February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building mysteriously burned down. The Nazis immediately blamed the communists and declared a state of emergency, portraying the incident as a communist coup attempt. This provided the perfect pretext to completely suppress dissent and suspend democratic rights. Fundamental freedoms were suspended, and thousands of communists, social democrats, and political opponents were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The subsequent enabling law, Ermächtigungsgesetz, effectively ended democratic institutions by granting Hitler the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval. This law was a constitutional coup that undermined the foundations of the Weimar Constitution, allowing Hitler to legally crush all opposition. Trade unions were shut down, other political parties were banned, the press was completely controlled, and the first systematic discrimination laws against Jews were enacted. German society was gradually turning into a police state. Organizations like the Gestapo, secret state police, and the SS, Schutzstaffel, spun a pervasive web of fear. With the death of President Hindenburg in 1934, Hitler combined the offices of Chancellor and President, assuming the title of Führer and Reich Chancellor. Now, absolute power was in the hands of a single man, and his decisions became law. The army swore allegiance to him. Democracy, with its own legal processes, had served to foster the rise of a dictator. The system had activated its own mechanism of self-destruction. Hitler's rise to power was not merely a political revolution, but also a collective surrender of German society. A nation blinded by fear, propaganda, and despair had sown the seeds of its own destruction. Seeds that would soon escalate into a war that would engulf the entire world. Adolf Hitler's rise to power is one of the most painful and disturbing lessons history has to offer. This is not just a German story. It is a universal warning of how societies can succumb to demagogues who feed on fear and hatred amidst economic crises and political instability. Seeing how he transformed from an ordinary life into a propagandist and mass manipulator is vital to understanding the dark side of human nature. Hitler's flawless propaganda machine laid bare how lies, myths, and a cult of personality can enslave a nation. This story offers us a clear message from the past. Democracy, freedom, and human rights are fragile values that must be constantly defended. We must recognize our social vulnerabilities, recognize the dangers of demagogy and hate speech, and remain vigilant to prevent history from repeating itself. If you enjoy discovering such cautionary lessons and dark secrets behind the scenes of history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for new discoveries and in-depth analyses. In our next video, we'll examine another critical turning point in history,